I've read a lot of stories over the years. I've gone through old case files, forgotten newspaper articles, and countless reports. And every time I come across a case that genuinely gives me chills, I always catch myself thinking, this has to be the craziest one yet. Then, somehow, another one comes along that's even stranger. The Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those stories, because no matter how many times I revisit this case, one question always stays with me. What could have possibly made 9 experienced hikers abandon the only thing keeping them alive? It was January 1959 when a group of 10 experienced hikers set out on an expedition through the northern Ural Mountains in what was then the Soviet Union. This wasn't some spontaneous adventure. Every member of the group had experienced surviving brutal winter conditions, and their leader, Igor Dyatlov, carefully planned the entire route. If everything went according to plan, completing the expedition would earn them one of the highest hiking certifications in the country. For the first few days, that's exactly what happened. They laughed together, took photographs, kept journals, and pushed deeper into the snowy wilderness. Looking back at those pictures today is almost unsettling. They're smiling, joking around, completely unaware that those would become the last photographs ever taken of them. Then, one member, Yuri Yudin, became too sick to continue. Reluctantly, he turned back and returned home. It probably felt like terrible luck at the time. Instead, it saved his life. The remaining 9 hikers continued toward a mountain known as Holatsiakl, or Dead Mountain. Despite the ominous name, it likely referred to the lack of wildlife in the area, not anything supernatural. Still, it's hard not to pause when you know what's coming next. On the evening of February 1st, the group pitched their tent high on an exposed mountainside. Why they chose that spot instead of the shelter below is still debated. They ate dinner, settled in for the night, and zipped themselves into their sleeping bags. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. When the group failed to return on schedule, search teams were sent into the mountains. What they found made no sense. The tent was still standing. Inside were warm clothes, boots, food, cameras, almost everything the hikers would have needed to survive. But the tent had been slashed open from the inside. It was as if they had been so desperate to get out that they didn't even use the entrance. Footprints led away from the campsite. Some were barefoot. Others wore only socks. A few had a single shoe. Think about that for a second. These were experienced hikers. They understood that stepping into freezing temperatures without proper clothing could kill you in minutes. So what frightened them enough to make that choice? The first bodies were found beneath a large cedar tree nearly a mile away. Someone had built a small fire, suggesting they were desperately trying to stay warm. Others were discovered scattered between the tree and the tent, as if they had tried to find their way back but never made it. Months later, after the snow began to melt, the remaining 4 hikers were finally discovered buried beneath deep snow in a nearby ravine. Some of them had suffered devastating internal injuries, broken ribs and skull fractures, yet showed surprisingly little external trauma. One victim was missing her tongue, while others were missing soft tissue that investigators later suggested could have been the result of natural decomposition and scavenging. Over the decades, countless theories have tried to explain what happened that night. An avalanche, powerful katabatic winds, secret Soviet military tests, even infrasound causing panic. The truth is, every theory seems to explain part of the mystery, but none of them explain everything. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation and later concluded that an avalanche-like snow slab was the most likely cause. Many experts believe it's a reasonable explanation. Others remain unconvinced. And maybe that's why the Dyatlov Pass incident still fascinates people more than 60 years later. Not because of ghosts, not because of monsters, but because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones where the evidence is right in front of us, and it still isn't enough to tell us what really happened that freezing night on Dead Mountain. All right, this next story is a little different. Usually when people talk about a haunted place, there's one event that made it famous. Skinwalker Ranch doesn't really work like that. The deeper I looked into it, the more bizarre the stories became, and after a while, I honestly wasn't sure whether I was reading one mystery or 10 completely different ones happening in the exact same place. Skinwalker Ranch sits on about 500 acres in northeastern Utah. If you drove past it today, you'd probably never give it a second thought. It's surrounded by open fields, rolling hills, and mountains stretching into the distance. On the surface, it looks like the perfect place to raise cattle and enjoy a quiet life. But according to the people who've lived there, quiet is the last word they'd use to describe it. The ranch became famous in the mid-1990s after Terry and Gwen Sherman bought the property. They weren't paranormal investigators or ghost hunters, they were ranchers looking for a fresh start. They expected long days working the land, taking care of livestock, and settling into country life. Instead, they found themselves at the center of one of America's strangest mysteries. One of the first incidents happened shortly after they moved in. The family spotted what looked like an enormous wolf wandering near their cattle. At first, Terry Sherman wasn't too concerned. Large predators occasionally passed through the area. What caught his attention was how unusually calm the animal was. Instead of running away, it allowed people to walk surprisingly close while it focused on one of the calves. When the wolf grabbed the calf, Terry did what most ranchers probably would have. He pulled out his handgun and fired. According to Terry, the animal barely reacted. Assuming he'd somehow missed, he fired again, but the wolf simply stood there as though the bullets meant nothing. It wasn't until several more shots were fired that it finally released the calf, turned around, and slowly disappeared into the darkness. The strange part didn't end there. When the family followed its tracks, they claimed the footprints suddenly stopped in the middle of the ground. There were no signs the animal had changed direction or kept walking. It was almost as if it had simply vanished. At that point, most people would have convinced themselves there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the wind covered the tracks. Maybe everything happened so fast that it only seemed unusual. The problem was, that wasn't the only strange thing happening on the ranch. Over the following months, the Shermans reported seeing glowing lights drifting silently across the property after dark. Sometimes they hovered over nearby fields for several minutes. Other times, they shot across the sky with sudden movements that witnesses claimed didn't resemble airplanes or helicopters. Then, there were the figures. Family members described seeing dark human-shaped silhouettes standing near the tree line, watching the ranch from a distance before disappearing without making a sound. On other nights, they claimed to hear voices echoing across empty fields, even though nobody else was around. If that had been the end of it, Skinwalker Ranch probably would have faded into local folklore. Instead, things became even stranger. The family's cattle started disappearing. Some were eventually found dead under unusual circumstances. Others seemed to vanish completely. Reports of unexplained cattle mutilations had already been circulating throughout parts of the American West for years, and before long, Skinwalker Ranch became one of the places most often associated with those stories. Naturally, rumors spread. Some people believed the Shermans were exaggerating. Others believed every word. One man who took the reports seriously was billionaire businessman Robert Bigelow. In 1996, he purchased the ranch with one goal in mind: finding out what was really happening. Unlike television ghost hunters looking for entertainment, Bigelow funded a scientific research group known as the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS. He brought in scientists, engineers, former law enforcement officers, and researchers. They installed surveillance cameras, motion sensors, radiation detectors, and every piece of equipment they thought might capture solid evidence. You'd think that if strange things were really happening, this would finally settle the mystery. It didn't. According to several researchers involved with the project, equipment occasionally malfunctioned without explanation. Cameras reportedly stopped working at crucial moments, batteries drained unexpectedly, and some investigators claimed they witnessed unusual lights in the sky or experienced events they couldn't easily explain. At the same time, skeptics argued there still wasn't any convincing scientific evidence that anything paranormal was taking place. Many pointed out that eyewitness accounts, no matter how sincere, aren't the same as proof. And honestly, that's what makes this story so fascinating. Unlike most famous haunted locations, Skinwalker Ranch has been investigated by ranchers, scientists, journalists, television crews, and curious visitors for decades. Yet, despite all that attention, nobody has been able to reach a conclusion that satisfies everyone. Some people believe the reports can be explained by wildlife, weather, psychology, and coincidence. Others think unusual geological conditions in the area might account for at least some of the strange experiences. And then there are those who believe the ranch is home to something we've simply never been able to understand. Personally, I don't know what's happening out there, but I do know this. Very few places in the world have inspired this many eyewitness accounts, investigations, and debates over such a long period of time. Whether Skinwalker Ranch is the result of folklore, misunderstood natural phenomena, or something genuinely unexplained, it continues to challenge anyone who tries to neatly explain it. And maybe that's why people keep coming back. Not because they're certain they'll find the answer, but because every visit seems to leave them with one more question than they had before. The story begins in the early 1800s on a quiet farm near Adams, Tennessee, where John Bell lived with his wife Lucy and their children. By all accounts, they were an ordinary family. They worked the land, attended church, and lived a peaceful life that wasn't much different from anyone else in the community. That ordinary life purportedly changed one evening when John noticed a strange animal wandering through his cornfield. At first, he thought it was a large black dog, but the closer he looked, the less familiar it seemed. Some descriptions compared it to a dog with the head of a rabbit. Others claimed it looked like no animal anyone had ever seen before. Confused, John raised his rifle and fired. When the smoke cleared, the creature was gone. Most people would probably dismiss something like that as poor visibility or an overactive imagination. John tried to do exactly that, but according to the Bell family's own accounts, the strange encounter was only the beginning. Not long afterward, unusual sounds began echoing through the house after dark. It started with faint knocking on the walls, almost as if someone outside was trying to get their attention. Then came scratching beneath the floorboards, footsteps in empty rooms, and what sounded like chains being dragged across the wooden floor late at night. John searched the house more than once, convinced an animal had gotten inside. Every search ended the same way. Nothing. As the weeks passed, the disturbances became harder to ignore. The Bell family's youngest daughter, Betsy, began waking up in the middle of the night terrified. She claimed someone was pulling at her blankets while she slept. Other times, she said invisible hands tugged her hair or slapped her across the face. Her screams would bring the entire family running, but every room they searched was empty. Naturally, word began spreading through the community. Some neighbors laughed at the stories. Others were curious enough to spend the night at the Bell home just to see if there was any truth behind them. Several visitors later claimed they had heard the strange noises for themselves, and a few even insisted they experienced things they couldn't explain. Then the story took an even stranger turn. According to those who were there, the mysterious presence eventually began speaking. At first, it was little more than whispers drifting through the house. Over time, those whispers became clear conversations. The unseen voice laughed, sang hymns, quoted passages from the Bible, and even revealed personal information about visitors that it supposedly had no way of knowing. Eventually, the entity introduced itself by a single name: Kate. From that point on, people stopped referring to the strange events as a haunting. They simply called it the Bell Witch. One detail that appears again and again in the legend is how differently the entity treated members of the Bell family. Lucy and the younger children were said to be left mostly alone, while Betsy and John Bell became its primary targets. The voice constantly mocked John, insulted him, and, according to the stories, even struck him without warning whenever he tried to ignore it. As the years passed, John's health began to deteriorate. He suffered unexplained episodes of weakness, difficulty speaking, and violent facial spasms. Doctors of the time couldn't agree on what was causing his condition, and in December of 1820, John Bell died. What happened next is perhaps the most controversial part of the entire story. According to family accounts, a small bottle containing an unknown liquid was discovered near John's bed. The mysterious voice allegedly claimed responsibility for his death, boasting that it had finally accomplished what it set out to do. Whether that actually happened has never been proven. In fact, many historians believe large parts of the Bell Witch story became more dramatic as they were passed from one generation to the next. Even the famous tale that future President Andrew Jackson visited the Bell farm remains heavily debated, with little historical evidence to confirm it. And maybe that's exactly why this story has survived for so long. It's a strange mix of documented history, eyewitness accounts, folklore, and decades of retelling. Somewhere along the way, those pieces blended together into one of America's most endearing ghost stories. So was the Bell family haunted by something they couldn't explain? Or did an ordinary family become the center of a legend that simply grew bigger with every generation that told it? More than 200 years later, no one knows for certain. But if a story can still spark that question after all this time, maybe that's its greatest mystery of all.